support the important people in children's lives by providing them with the knowledge, skills, and resources they need to help children develop a positive racial identity. And third is to raise awareness of the ways children are impacted by race. We achieve these goals by working with parents, educators, and community members, by integrating the arts, by evaluating our work, by learning about the research, and by sharing information more broadly with folks like you. Our staff includes myself and Medina Jackson, our Director of Engagement, as well as 2 newly hired consultants who will be helping us with communications and training work. We're also very close to hiring a new administrative/communications assistant. Tonight, we have technical assistance from Amy Palikaris, who works for another program at the Office of Child Development called Healthy Child. Thank you so much, Amy. And our American Sign Language service is being provided by Moore Interpreting LLC. Thank you, Shannon Morrison. And for anyone who may have to jump off the Zoom event, it's being recorded, so you'll have access to it at a later date. In case you're wondering what tonight's program will entail, here's a quick rundown. I'll introduce Cynthia, who will start us off with a great story. Then I'll introduce Dr. Jeffries, and he'll present for about 30 minutes. After that, he and I will have a conversation, and then we'll drop a poll question on screen immediately after to get your feedback. Then we'll open up the program to questions from the audience. Following that, we have 2 sets of books tonight to raffle off, so please hang around for that if you can. I want to start us off with a quote from Howard Zinn, one of the world's most renowned historians, since we are talking about history today. According to Zinn, history is instructive. What it suggests to people is that even if they do little things, if they walk on a picket line, if they join a vigil, if they write a letter to their local newspaper, anything they do, however small, becomes part of a much larger sort of flow of energy. And when enough people do enough things, however small they are, then changes take place. As we think about early educators working for such little pay and all of them doing such important and challenging work, I can imagine that it might be easy for them in the hustle and bustle of the day to overlook the little things or the impact those little things can have on young children. I would suggest instead that they begin to see great value in those little things, just as we should see great value in those educators. And now on to Cynthia. Cynthia Battle is an early literacy educator, advocate, Black storyteller, and founder of Kyrifa Readers and Storytellers. With more than 30 years of experience in early childhood education, Cynthia has worked with families and children, building on the importance of reading development. She's a member of the National Association of Black Storytellers, the United Black Book Clubs of Pittsburgh, and she serves on the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh's Best Books for Babies Committee. I've known Cynthia since our time at Beginning with Books, which was an emergent literacy program that for a couple decades did great literacy work in the region. And I'll add that this bio does not fully convey her remarkable passion for young children and literacy, her exceptional family engagement, knowledge, and skills, and her wonderful storytelling abilities. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Cynthia Battle.
Thank you so much, Aisha, for that wonderful intro. I'd like to start off by telling you a little something about a poem that I wrote for Linda Goss, who is a very well-known storyteller. I'll be telling her story, The Frog Who Wanted to Be a Singer. But right now, this is a tribute to a real, true storyteller. With her big old smile and her eyes that shine, she takes her God-given talent and spreads it around. Her words grab you and carry you away to those faraway places where the animals play. Before you know it, you met birds that talk, Elephants that fly and frogs that rock. She got granddaddy stories from way back when to capture the spirit of how things were then. There's one story she tells about a peach cobbler pie. The taste she describes, my, oh my, you mean you ain't heard? She got stories on top of stories, a bunch of thirsty song. She got rap stories, song stories, stories about pride. You know, I've seen her turn a scarf into a story one time with a big old smile and her eyes that shine. That girl takes her God-given talent and spreads it around. She inspired me. I want to ask you something. Have you ever been frustrated? Yeah, you know you have. We're going to go back to a time when all the animals could talk and walk like we do now. Now we're going to pay a little attention to a frog. We'll call him Froggy. Now Froggy was very interesting because he had something, an ambition that was not really popular for frogs. Froggy wanted to be a singer. So every day he practiced on his lily pad, doo-doo, doo-doo, doo-doo. And before you know it, he got that old feeling of frustration because he knew that nobody wanted to hear him to sing because the only animals that sang in the forest were the birds. Oh boy, did he feel discouraged. And then he thought, wait a minute, let me go tell my parents about my newfound ambition. Maybe they'll support me. He leaps home. And of course, his mother was all for it, but his dad had some doubts. His mother overread that, okay? So then he was so happy that his mother encouraged him. He ran off and said he was gonna play with his friends. He ran into big frog, skinny frog, short frog, tall frog. And he said, yo, frogs, guess what? I got some news. And short frog said, what you got, man? What you got? He said, I got talent. And tall frog said, you know, we all got talent. He said, no, I want to be a singer. Oh man, why did he say that? They start laughing at him. A singer, you ugly frog, you know you can't sing, but I really can sing. Oh man, they laughed at him. He could hear them far off in the distance, just laughing at him. Again, that old familiar feeling of frustration went over and covered him. And then just as he was ready to really burst, he thought, wait a minute, why don't I just go join the singing group with the birds? That's right, why not? So he goes over to where the birds live, and they lived in a beautiful condominium in the better part of the forest. He goes there, he say, yo birds, and the birds look down and say, oh, it's Froggy, come on up. He's excited now. He leaps up over to their house. They say, what do you want, Froggy? He said, well, he was a little scared, a little shy, but he said, I want to join your group. And the birds was like, oh, very nicely. Pick up that bucket over there and just bring it over here. He said, no, I want to join your singing group. Oh my gosh, the whole room froze. The birds chimed in and said, get out, get out, get out. They all pushed him off. Oh, Froggy felt that old familiar feeling again of that frustration. And just as he was ready to pop, another idea came to his mind. Every Friday night down at the juke joint, the fox ran this little club and he would let the animals sing. Well, really the birds. So he said, why don't I just go and ask Fox? So he goes and knocks on Fox's door. Brother Fox, Brother Fox. Brother Fox looks around, opens the door. You know how the fox is. He's a sly, slick, and the wicked. He said, what is it, Frog? He said, oh, Brother Frogs, please let me join you. Let me come in and sing on Friday. The fox said, man, you want me to close down? Oh, don't nobody want to hear you sing. But Froggy was persistent. He said, please, please, please. Fox got to thinking, wait a minute, this could be a new comedy show. So he said, all right then, Froggy, be down here at 8 o'clock on the nose, not 7:59, not 8:01. Froggy was so excited as he went off just singing and hopping and laughing and happy. He didn't know that the fox had called all the animals and said, listen, you know what? When Frog get on that stage, I want you to boo him. Well, Monday came. Froggy was practicing for la 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 all day long. Tuesday, he threw some showmanship into it. For la 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 la. Wednesday, his parents gave him the Macy card. He went downtown, got him a hat, a medallion that said, yeah, it's me, Froggy. A cane, and then Thursday came, he stayed in the bathtub all day, just shining. Friday came, he put all that stuff together and he was fine. And right on time, he was at at the juke joint. Well, he got there and the fox was on the stage and he said, okay, everybody, I want you to put your hands together for the frog. All right, now this is something new we're trying. Well, Froggy was so happy when the curtain opened. He was standing there with his head down, and as his head slowly raised and you saw his medallion, he was just ready to sing, and you heard somebody say, get off the stage, you old ugly frog. And then a tomato hit him. Then all the animals just started throwing things at him. Oh, Froggy felt that frustration coming through him again. And as he slowly walked off the stage, he could hear Fox laughing and say, oh, that was just a little something. All right. So he said, are you ready? Are you ready for the real show, real show tonight? And all the animals was like, yeah, yeah, yeah. But Froggy was in the back in the wings on the stage, and he can hear all this. And so the birds, he said, are you ready for the B, the I, the R, the D, the S, the birds? And the audience went crazy. Now I gotta tell you something really quickly about the birds. They had a beautiful voice, and they kind of put animals in a trance, and it sounded a little something like this. All the animals were swaying and swaying, and Froggy's in the back. He's mad, that frustration. Froggy got to thinking, wait a minute, I didn't come down here, practice all week, get all short to be booed off. He ran up to that stage, knocked them birds off, grabbed that microphone and said, what you want, baby, I got it. And what you need, you know I got it. All I'm asking is for a little respect. Baby, I'm Froggy. Yeah. Then he heard, suck it to me, 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 suck it to me. Oh, and he looked around and the birds was on the stage and they was just dancing. Suck it to me, suck it to me, suck it to me. R-E-S-P-E-C-T, find out what it means to me. R-E-S-P-E-C-T, hey, I am Froggy and the birds. So the moral of that story is don't never let anybody tell you what you can't do. How do you think we were able to stand here and be who we are today? Thank you. Cynthia Battle, and that was a Linda Goss story.
Oh my gosh, Cynthia. It's a good thing I had my microphone on silent because I was just laughing and enjoying that. That was so wonderful. I think you may have missed your calling with all that singing. We have to talk about that after all this. Thank you for the hearts, because yes, that was beautiful, wonderful, Cynthia.
Thank you.
I think we could all stand to have more stories in our lives, right? Especially stories like that. Thanks again. And as you noticed at the very beginning of our program, we were having a little bit of technical difficulties. We understand from some of our friends that you are not able to access the chat. So please feel free to put your comments into the Q&A section, because I think that box is actually working. And again, we apologize for that. Now on to Dr. Jeffries. Dr. Hassan Kwame Jeffries graduated from Morehouse College with a BA in history and earned his PhD in American history with a specialization in African American history from Duke University. In addition to teaching, researching, and writing about the African American experience, Hassan has also collaborated on several public history projects, including serving as the lead scholar and primary scriptwriter for the renovation and redesign of the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. He's also contributed to documentary film projects, including the PBS documentary, Black America Since MLK and Still I Rise. Hassan regularly shares his expertise through public lectures, op-eds, and interviews with such media outlets as the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, NPR, CNN, and MSNBC. I guess I could say that we are dealing with a muckety muck right now. And his commitment to teaching hard history led him to edit Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement, a collection of essays that explores how to teach civil rights history accurately and effectively. He's also hosted the podcast Teaching Hard History, a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Learning for Justice Division, which is how I first met him when I was a guest on the podcast. Hassan takes great pride in opening students' minds to new ways of understanding the past and present. And for all that hard work, he's received numerous awards, including the Ohio State Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Hassan Jeffries.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. White. It is good to be reunited with you in conversation. As you mentioned, we had a wonderful conversation when you joined us on the Teaching Hard History podcast to talk about subjects relevant to the work that you do and to talk a little bit about what we will discuss here today. So I'm really excited to share some thoughts and ideas with you and with the P.R.I.D.E community. And look forward to the dialogue and discussion to follow my remarks. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I believe I have screen sharing capability, and I do. Let me see if I can do this. Yes, 1 second. A new computer has given me some difficulties. 1 second. Well, I may not be able to share screen, but that's okay. Time is of the essence, so we will, in the spirit of the ancestors, we shall proceed. We shall proceed. So this question of race and racism and its importance and significance for early childhood professionals to be not just aware of the ways in which it shapes the contours of the lives of people today, but the ways in which it continues to impact our society as a whole, from the past to the present. And so I want to spend a few minutes talking about this idea of the importance of racial history, of America's history of dealing with race and racism to the early childhood profession. And before we dive into that, I think it's important that we recognize the moment in which we are living, the moment in which we are engaging in work with young learners. What is this moment? Just 2 years ago, we witnessed the largest public protests in American history, following the murder of George Floyd in June of 2020. Some 25 to 30 million people took to the streets of the United States and took to the streets globally, demanding justice for the victims of police violence. That was clear, right? In June and July, in both months, 30 to 35 to 20, 25, 30 million people take to the streets, demanding justice for the victims of police violence and extra-legal violence. So Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery. But the folk who took to the streets, and many of us were included in those protests, were also seeking recognition of Black humanity. That's why those beautiful murals began to dot the American landscape, describing, calling out, demanding that we not only say the names of the victims of racial violence and racial terrorism, but that we state unequivocally that Black lives matter, seeking recognition of Black humanity, demanding some respect, some RESPECT, right? Just like P.R.I.D.E, right? But then there was a third component that was a part of what was being asked as people were taken to the streets, and that we are living still in this moment. And that was when led by young people, this demand to remove these monuments to white supremacy. And this is important because it wasn't just a function of, hey, take down these old Confederate generals and these enslavers. What young people were saying was that they knew intuitively that the history that they had been taught was full of fabrications and lies, and that what they wanted was an honest account of the past, because they understood, taught by some, understood intuitively by others, that in order to make sense of the present, that they had to understand the past. And they could not make sense of the present, of the problems that we continue to face today, if they did not understand the past in its fullness, history the way it happened. Now, when you combine that, because that's a serious demand there, right? I mean, justice for the victims of police violence surely and clearly is important, but that's about individuals. But when you're saying, look, we got to look to the past and we got to talk honestly about the past, now you're talking about how we understand society as a whole. And when you combine that to what the fourth demand was, and the fourth demand was an end to systemic racism, now you're beginning to upset the apple cart, right? Because if you are calling for the nation, for elected officials to end systemic racism, there is only one thing that they can do in response to that. That is to change systems and structures to address the persistent inequality born of those systems and structures. But if you do not want to change that because you benefit from the status quo, then the response that we saw, and this is the moment that we are in now, 2 years later, the response that we saw was to deny the existence of systemic racism. And this plays out now. How do we go from these protests calling for an end to systemic racism, calling for justice for the victims of police violence, to suddenly banning books and passing laws saying that you're not going to talk about anything that would make little white boys and little white girls uncomfortable? Because it's not just about the feelings of little white boys and little white kids. It's about who's making money off of the status quo, who's profiting, who is benefiting from the status quo in the moment. And that is what has led us to the moment in which we are in, and why it is so critically important that starting from the youngest age, we engage our students, our children, our young people in honest and frank and open conversations about the role of race and racism in American society. We are right now in the midst of, where it seems like decades ago, but it was barely half a decade ago that Barack Obama was president of the United States. And he rolls into office on the politics of hope. We may disagree with on both the right and the left, perhaps, with his policy choices, but there is no disagreement that the wave that he rode into office was about hope. It was about hope and change. We are no longer dealing in the era of the politics of hope and possibility. We are dealing in the era of the politics of hate. And when we think about that, and this is the politics of Donald Trump, this is the politics of hate. When we think about that, it makes the necessity for talking to children, to young people, especially to young kids of color, makes that necessity all the more urgent, that we prepare them for what is to come, right? For what they are facing, for what they are in fact seeing. But that's difficult because there are real challenges when we think and want to talk about the role of race and racism in society in the past and present. And the number one, the principal challenge is that race itself ain't real, right? It's a fiction. It's a fabrication. Race as a concept is biologically meaningless. It's something that some European dudes made up 500 years ago to justify what would become the transatlantic slave trade. right? It's biologically meaningless. There's no biological difference of any real significance tied to this thing called skin color and race between anybody who's on this call or anybody in the world. It's just meaningless. It's made up. But here's the thing. It's biologically meaningless. So we really, in theory, shouldn't pay it any attention. But we have to, because this thing called race is socially meaningful. Biologically meaningless, but socially meaningful. It has shaped the contours of the lives of people around the world for the last 500 plus years and continues to shape the lives of us today, right? So socially meaningful. It has created social hierarchy based on this fiction and this fabrication. And the implications of that social hierarchy we're still dealing with today. And so while in theory, we should be able to ignore something that isn't real, that's a fiction and a fabrication, we can't, because it has this social meaningfulness. And at the same time, while it's socially meaningful, we use race here in America as a stand-in for cultural heritage and for cultural ancestry. So we not only use race to create this hierarchy, but we use race as a way to understand people's culture, right? And because of these last two components, race being socially meaningful and race being culturally relevant, we can't ignore it. We can't fall into the colorblind trap. While it would be nice to say, like, oh, well, you know, if race is causing all these problems, let's pretend as though it doesn't exist. We can't pretend as though it doesn't shape and impact the lives of people today, and certainly the lives of people of color, but the lives of everybody, right? This isn't just group specific. And so we have to avoid the colorblind trap, which is why one of the principal reasons why we have to talk about race with our children, right? Because there is no avoiding it. And when we pretend as though we can, right? And I've had this encounter many a time. One of the last times, right before the pandemic, I hopped on a plane in Memphis, Tennessee, and I was flying back to Columbus, Ohio, and I had a long day of work down in Memphis, long weekend of work down in Memphis. I was a little tired. I jump on a plane, grab my seat, and I'm looking out the window, and here comes my seatmate, nice Southern white lady coming down the aisle, and she sits down. And I'm from New York, but I still got manners. And so when she says hello, I say hello in response. How you doing? And at that moment, I really should have just turned away and just put my head and closed my eyes. But, you know, she says, oh, what are you doing? What brings you here? And, I told her, I said, I'm doing some work at the Civil Rights Museum. And then right there, she had that look in her eye. And I was like, oh, I know it's coming. And she was like, oh, my best friend growing up, she was Black and I don't see race and all this other stuff, right? Like, oh, Lord, I should have told her I was a carpenter. But the point is that at that moment, what she did, well-meaning and well-intentioned, was she actually erased me by saying that she doesn't see race, by pretending that she doesn't see me as a person of color, as an African-American. Then she actually erased me because it was the racialized experiences of my parents growing up in the Jim Crow North in Connecticut and New York and New Jersey. It was the racialized experience of my grandparents growing up in the Jim Crow South that made me who I am today, passed down through the generations. It was the experiences of my enslaved great-grandparents down in Georgia that made me who I am. So if you pretend that you don't see race, you pretend that you don't see me, then you're erasing their experiences, and their experiences are me, right? And we don't want to do that. So the problem, and this is important when we think about talking about race and engaging with questions of race with children, the problem has never been talking about race, right? It's okay to talk about race, although we get a little nervous when we do. That's not the problem, or even identifying people by race. That ain't the problem either. The problem is discriminating against people on the basis of race. The problem is judging people based on stereotypes that you have connected to this thing called race. That's the problem. Right. And so what we want to do is get our children into a position where, fine, they can understand and see people by race and be comfortable by that, but they're not judging people because of it. They're appreciating the possibility that their experiences may be different, that their worldview may be different, because race is a determinant, a predictor of how people are more likely to have a certain set of experiences. But we don't want them to judge and discriminate based upon it. But But so we have to talk about it. We have to recognize it. Now, the other reason why it's so critically important that we do engage in conversations and structured conversations with our youngest learners is that children see race. Like we may want to think that they don't, but they absolutely do. We know that children as young as 6 months old are able to identify people they encounter by race because of the cues and clues that they're picking up from their caregivers. We know that children as young as 2 years old are already using race to explain behavior. We know that children as young as 3 and 5 years old are already exhibiting prejudice, that they have by age 6, so we're talking about kindergarten by 1st grade, they are already showing in the United States, children across the board are already demonstrating a preference for whiteness, a preference for whiteness. Now, overwhelmingly, white children in the surveys that I've seen, 80% or so will demonstrate that preference for whiteness. But for African-American children, we're talking about 55, 60% are also showing a similar preference for whiteness. And so this thing called race and how it plays out ain't neutral. And our children are being exposed to it and seeing it, right? And that preference is so critically important because that shapes how they walk through the world. And so by the time they get to age 10, age 14, middle school, right before they even get to high school, they're looking for confirmation of their racialized understanding of the world. And so what I offer and what I posit here is that, you know, we have to look at, there was a time before this pandemic when vaccines were okay and inoculations was something that people actually were like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. But we have to think about these conversations around race and racism with children as an inoculation, right, against the white supremacist world that they are going to encounter, to ward off that which they will be inevitably exposed to and that which they are already being exposed to, right, as a defense mechanism, both for the children who will suffer the harm of it, but because it's directed, the prejudice and the hate is directed at them, but also the children who will be doing the directing, because there is a psychological harm in that as well. And so collectively, we have no choice but to engage in frank and honest conversation in age-appropriate ways with young people, with our children. And at the same time, this isn't just sort of thinking about sort of race and deconstructing racialized stereotypes and the like. We also have to make sure that our children understand racism, right? I mean, because sometimes we have these conversations about race, but we don't talk about racism. And we got to talk about the racism because it manifests, and our children have to understand this, it manifests itself in personal ways. And the kids will encounter it. They'll encounter that on the playground. I have 3 daughters. Every single one of them, before they even hit the 1st grade, had encountered some form of very direct racism on the playground and in their classroom before they hit the 1st grade, right? So they're encountering this. They're usually encountering what they see on a personal level, that explicit bias, and sometimes it's implicit bias that is directed in our subconscious, that prejudice that manifests and comes out, that is touching our children. So they're gonna get it, and they're gonna get it early. And that can be sort of, you know, that can be seen as what's visible to them. What's less visible, that is harder to translate, is the structural racism, right? The ways in which systems and structures create an environment that leads to inequality, right? And so part of that conversation is the conversations that we have as we take our children through their lived environment. What do they see in these segregated neighborhoods? What do they see when they go into one particular neighborhood that happens to be working class, lower income, low wealth communities? There ain't no grocery stores. There aren't any parks around, right? I mean, kids they see this, but we have to help them translate that. So how should we do this? Let me add this, and I'll give a couple quick points, and then Dr. White, invite you back into dialogue and into discussion. You know, one of the challenges with doing this, right, having these conversations, teaching and talking about this with young people, is that racism is actually, it doesn't make any sense. Like, race doesn't make any sense. So you're telling a child, and children are logical thinkers, right? So you're telling a child, like, hey, don't judge people by race, but I need you to understand race exists, right? Race ain't real, but race is real at the same time, right? It doesn't work. I had, when my oldest daughter, who's 12 now, was 4 years old, I was really excited when she came and she hopped on the sofa with me to watch the baseball game, right? And the Mets were playing, from New York, the Mets were playing. And she was like, Dad, she's like, you watching the game? I was like, yeah, is it baseball? I was like, yeah. She's like, well, tell me about it. I mean, I've been waiting all my life for this, right? To sit down and tell my child, explain to my child, to baseball, right? Like this is the family pastime. This is what we do. And so I'm like, okay, look, now here's the batter, there's the pitcher. The pitcher throws the ball, the batter hits the ball, the batter standing at home plate, the batter will run the first, but eventually they want to get back to home. And so her first question was, well, the batter's at home? I'm like, yes. And the batter wants to get back to home? I'm like, yes. Well, why didn't the batter just stay there? I'm like, oh, because that's not the rules, right? Like, no, stop. Okay. So the batter runs to first. It's like, well, why didn't the batter run the other way? After about 5 minutes of this, I was like, you know what? Just go play outside, right? Why? Because the game was illogical because she didn't understand the rules, right? And until they understand the rules, then what they see doesn't make sense. So it's the same thing with the world in which we live. We have to make clear the role of race and racism in American society, because those are the rules, right? Those are the parameters of the game, right? So that they can understand. Now, we can play outside the rules, that's fine, but you got to understand, you can change the game, but you got to understand what the rules of the game are in order to understand what they're seeing, right? And so the illogic, the absence of logic with race, because it's again illogical, makes that conversation and teaching and talking about it that much more difficult. But we just have to be aware of that. So what can and should we do, especially for early education professionals and parents and the like, all right, when talking about this history? Because this isn't new, right? I mean, this literally, we're talking about creation of race as a construct 500 years ago. For 400 years, we're talking about 1619 to the present. We know a lot of white folk lost their mind when people start talking about 1619. But that's just the reality. Slavery is what America chose to do, right? Didn't invent it, but it's what America chose to do. And that creates the trajectory that this nation would move forward. 2.5 centuries of the institution of slavery. And once that's over, the rationalizations and the justifications for holding people in bondage, holding Black people in bondage, that ideology of white supremacy continues over for another century and a half. So the legacy of slavery is a belief in white supremacy, right? And combine that belief in white supremacy with capitalism and racism, right? Like, that's America, right? Like, you want something unique, now there you go, right? Capitalism, racism give us slavery. Capitalism and racism give us Jim Crow. Capitalism and racism combined give us mass incarceration. That is us. That's who we are, right, as a nation. So when talking about these, dealing with this issue with our youngest learners, our children, there's a couple of ways that I think we can go about it that are productive, right? All age appropriate, of course, but then I think these are the sort of principles that are applicable across all ages, but we can do these with our youngest learners themselves. The first thing is you got to be clear, right? Language matters. And so when talking historically about race and racism in American society, if we're talking about slavery, right, we're not talking, the language here matters. We're not just talking about slaves, right? We're talking about the language should be enslaved people, right? Because we have to use language that recognizes the humanity of us as people of color, right? Of people who have historically been marginalized, right? People talk about, there's no empathy for working class people or poor people. And it's like, because we never talk about them as being human beings. And it's the same thing. You can't expect children to connect with people who we never actually talk about human beings. We teach our children to be more empathetic to enslavers than we do to the enslaved, right? And that makes no sense. You people running around wondering why people think that they can be the next Donald Trump. It's like, oh, he's one of us. Because you taught them that somehow billionaires are empathetic figures, that they can be like, they got nothing in common with them. They got more in common. Your average child, certainly a Black child, a brown child, but even your average white child living in America today has more in common with an enslaved person than they do with George Washington, right? But yet, we're going to say George Washington is the one you got to emulate, right? The one that's holding people in bondage. So the language matters. Talking about enslaved people, recognizing humanity, but then also when talking about those who engaged in racist behavior, we got to name them too. These aren't just masters, these are enslavers. They are holding people in bondage, actively denying basic civil rights and human rights to other people. So we have to be clear in the language that we use. We can't dance around it anymore. We want to have a conversation about racism. Let's have a conversation about racism, not just a random conversation about race. I don't even know what that means. We have to be positive, right? When we're talking about marginalized groups that have been impacted and affected by racism. You have to be positive because the negative stereotypes are so dominant, right? And so that means the positive is not just in the language that we use, but it's also in the visual images that we have. We got to surround our children with positive images to combat the negative. So social psychologists tell us that negative images impact harder and last longer. And so it's not about one-to-one. We got to overwhelm our children with Black love, right? With this sense of pride, with this sense of beauty, right? And we have to constantly reinforce it because they're constantly being bombarded with it, right? So be clear in the language, be positive in terms of when we are having these conversations. Not always about the negative, right? We got to explain the negative, right? It's about the visual images of Black people being brutalized. That's there, that has to be explained, but we also got to lean into the positive. Have to be personal, right? And kids connect not to the abstract, especially earliest learners, but young children connect to people. They connect to stories. That's why the storytelling is so important, right? But we all have a story to tell as well. We all have a story to share, and we have to share that story. We have to share our story with our children. We have to, as teachers, as parents, as professionals, it's important to be personal, because one of the things that we're actually doing in that is we're giving, especially to our children, where as children of color, we're letting them know that the experience
Hold on, Dr. Jeffries. There's an echo happening. It's still echoing for some reason. It's like a reverb repeating over and over. I'm not sure why.
Never experienced it before, so I'm not sure why it's doing that or what we can do. I wonder if you jump off and jump back on, if it'll stop. Let's see if that'll help. Okay. So of course we're having more than anticipated technical difficulties. Hopefully Dr. Jeffries will be able to jump back on again before we start our conversation with him. So I'm thinking that perhaps we can shift the program around for a minute. Let's see.
Computer. Oh, wait, it left.
Stopped. Okay.
Did it cease?
Yes.
Okay.
That was rough.
I'm sorry.
No, it's not your fault. It's some kind of issue with the technology. So can you put your...
I don't have access to my camera.
Okay.
Yeah.
So everything that could possibly go wrong when we don't have a communications person is going
No, I think I just need to be given the host so I can start it up again.
Okay.
Just make me a co-host. I think we can get that.
Yeah, if Amy could do that. And
there
then we want you to finish your final point, because we certainly do want to hear that.
Okay. All right. We're making it through. That's all right. We make it through. We make it work.
We're trying anyway.
We make it work. Amen. Amen. So the last 2 or 3 points were simply this: when you share your story, and it's important that we share that personal story, that our kids understand who we are and where they came from, is that we also talk a little history. Like, we be contextual, right? So it's not just about the personal, it's not just about the individual. We create a historical context. So we got to do a little homework ourselves, so we can put what they're seeing in the moment into a proper context, and they can begin to see the bigger picture. That will help move them from simply understanding situations and circumstances as individual to the broader systemic and to the broader institutional. The last three sort of principles, ideas I think we need to take with us into engaging kids around these issues is: one, the youngest learners, we got to be open. We got to start where the children are, right? Like, this is fundamental civil rights organizing 101. Ella Baker, she said, start where the people are. We got to start where the children are, asking them, what do they think? What have they heard, right? So we know there's going to be some unlearning that has to be done, but we can't help them through that process of unlearning to learning if we don't know what it is that they need to unlearn, right? And the only way we can do that is if we ask those very pointed and direct questions. And kids will tell you, they will answer, right? And a lot of times we don't ask them because we don't want to know the answers and what they're thinking, but we have to. Right. So we have to start where children are. We have to be specific in our explanations and in our conversation. Right. Are we talking about personal manifestations of racial discrimination and racism and hatred? Are we talking about systemic and structural? Right. Are we talking about individual behavior, or are we talking about societal behavior? Right. So kids have to be able to understand that too, because if we leave them thinking that the problems of inequality in American society are simply because of bad individuals, then the solutions are actually really simple. Right? You just remove those bad individuals. But we know that removing a racist cop or a racist sheriff does not change the racist behavior of the police department, because it's not about the individuals, it's about the culture that has been established in that institution. So kids have to be aware of that. And then lastly, it's important that we be intentional, right, in our conversation. Now, some of it is reactionary, right? You see something on TV, a situation, we can't avoid what's going on in the world, and so we want to engage our children. We want to have a rapid response available, to the moment. But there also have to be times where we say, okay, I want to take my child from point A to point Z, right? How am I going to do that? What am I going to introduce? At what point are we going to talk about the challenges that Black folk and people of color have placed in America, and how are we going to talk about the successes and the achievements, right? And so we have to be intentional and build on it, right? It's like, okay, I want to talk about this when they're 3 and 4 years old. When they're 6 and 7 and 8 years old, we need to move forward and talk about this in this particular way, in a different way. We got to make this a complex story, and as our children age, we have to increase the complexity of what they're dealing with and what they're wrestling with, and they're able to process. I mean, it's not that children can't get it, right? The children get it, right? They're not afraid to have these conversations. They're not afraid to learn, right? It's us. We're the ones who don't want to deal with it, right? We're trying to protect their innocence. Ain't no innocence if you Black in America, right? That the innocence is lost at birth, right? And we just got to accept that. That's just the harsh reality of the moment. I'm a parent. I understand. I want to protect it, but we do more harm by not talking about it than we do by being silent, right? So I'll just leave it there, Dr. White, and then perhaps we'll dialogue. That's enough to sort of start a dialogue and conversation.
Oh my gosh, so many gems. I'm just going to repeat a few of them. I was typing away as you were talking. Biologically meaningless, socially meaningful. Race as a stand-in for culture. Conversations about race and racism as inoculation. I'm stealing all of your comments and ideas. I love the baseball analogy and the conversation about knowing the rules and the importance of being clear in our language, and especially that great example of enslaved people versus slaves. I actually have to catch myself to make sure I do that in all my conversations or writing. Name people who are engaged in racist behaviors. They're not masters, they're enslavers. That's really, really important. So yes, We have to be positive and surround our children with positive images. That's all that Pride is all about. Have to be personal, sharing our stories. And that's really important for kids to hear about those stories, because people are carrying those stories. A lot of times they're not sharing those stories in families. We have to be open, start where they are, be specific, be intentional, just loads and loads of gems. Thank you so much for that. You got a lot of hearts floating up here too. So I want to start out our conversation with a question about teaching about the colonial era. Yeah. And I'm hoping you didn't already answer, because you were offering so much information there. I was like, is he already answering questions? So hopefully not. And I want to preface it by saying first that the P.R.I.D.E program started offering a training model that includes 5 modules. And one of those modules covers the history of race and racism in America, looking specifically at empire building, colonialism, and the emergence of race. And we did that because we felt that that kind of information was absent from many professional development programs for early educators, and also because we felt that it was information that we felt people, meaning these educators, should have at least a surface understanding of. So what I'd like to ask you is, what would you say are some of the reasons people who teach young children should know about history, in particular, the colonial era? And here, when I say young children, I'm talking about children, say 3 to 9 years old.
Yeah, no, that's critically important. And that age group, but then also that era. Because one of the things that we have to acknowledge is we already teach that era, but we just teach it as a fairy tale, right? It's Thanksgiving, right? It's Plymouth Rock. It's a Disney version of what happened in Jamestown. So all the stuff that we talk about, like that now that we're not supposed to be teaching because we actually already teach it. It's just a myth. Right? I mean, one of the things that we do is, rather than confront hard history, rather than deal with the difficulties of this era, those aspects of the past that make us uncomfortable in the present, right? And colonialism, right, as it actually played out, makes us uncomfortable in the present, right? Enslaving people and committing genocide against Native people to seize their land, that makes us uncomfortable and uneasy. So rather than deal with that, we come up with these national myths, right? Of Pocahontas and John Smith and Plymouth Rock and all this other nonsense. So we take a little bit of historical truth and then twist it into something that makes us feel good, right? So the first thing is, we're already teaching them this stuff, and so this is the unlearning. So now we got to get them to unlearn all this stuff so they can make sense of what actually happened. Because once you actually look at colonialism and for what it actually was, right? And like, man, wait a minute. So you're going to take the labor of Africans and the land of Native people, right? Then suddenly, as they sort of move forward, then those national myths that are designed to create this sort of false sense of patriotism and blind loyalty to the state, they begin to fall away. And then children develop, starting at an early age, this desire to question, right? And that's what we want. It's critical thinking, right? Because once you get a little bit of history, then suddenly, right, stuff don't make sense. Like, wait, why are we celebrating this person like this, right? I mean, and that's the great fear as well, right? That's what has so many people nervous, right? Because once you start questioning these folk, right, like a James Madison, the framer of the Constitution, I get folk, Dr. White, who tell me all the time, you're teaching, you want to teach children to hate the founders, right? And I was like, look, one, I don't deal with hate, right? I said, but I am guilty. I am guilty as charged if the charge is I'm not teaching children to be like the founders, right? To be like a Jefferson or Washington or James Madison, because I don't want them to be like them. I want them and expect them to be better than them. These were people who were buying and selling folk. Why on earth do I want them to be like them? I do not. Right? And we shouldn't either. We should want them to be better than them. But the question then becomes, the question that children would have is, well, why do you want me to be better? What am I missing about understanding who these people are that is not enough just to be like them? And so the colonial era is really important, because that, I think to wrap up, I mean, there's 2 aspects that are important. When you deal with the colonial era, you're not just dealing with African Americans, you're dealing with African people who are in what would become America, right? And so that allows for the connection to the continent, right? That allows for the diaspora connection to be in place. And so we talk about 1619 as a starting point of the African journey in America, and certainly so, right? As it relates to the institution of slavery and where, but you can't talk about 1619 and the African folk who were brought here without talking about Africa itself. And so one, it's a point of entry, I think, to talk about Native peoples, but then also talk about African peoples and the cultural retentions that we see over here and how that informs what would become not just the African-American community, but this nation as a whole. So that's critically important, foundational for what would be sort of the Black experience and the American experience, right? I mean, everything from culinary arts to music, to crafts, but even into economics and industry. So all of that allows for that African genius, that African inspiration, African cultural retentions to be explored. So that's important. But then the colonial period is also what sets America on its trajectory, right? I mean, so this is the foundational period, and there are some choices, and this is what I was alluding to earlier, right? Like sometimes we talk about slavery as America's original sin, and it's not. Slavery is America's origin. Like, it is birthed in this thing called slavery, and it impacts and affects all aspects of what would become American society. And we have to understand that the foundation of the institution of slavery is violence justified by a belief in white supremacy. And our kids got to understand that. If our children understood that, then when you have people running around here who are embracing white supremacy explicitly, implicitly, and implicitly, then our children would recognize that that is inherently dangerous. Yeah. Because wherever, history tells us, starting in the colonial period, wherever white supremacists go, funerals follow, period. That's colonialism, and that's America today, right? And there's a line, a continuum that stretches back that we have to recognize. So when we talk about the colonial period, it's not just about, it's not just turkeys in Massachusetts, right? It's the harsh reality of the world that is crafted out of blood and violence and theft and thievery that will yield a political experiment, to be sure, but it's a political experiment born of that experience, and our kids have to understand that.
Oh, so eloquently put. Thank you for that. I had to control myself because I do a lot of so I'm trying to be quiet here so I don't interrupt what you're saying. So now I want to move to a question about specifically about teachers. And that is, in what ways would you say that learning about racial history and being able to make those contemporary connections might contribute to educators' personal growth and awareness?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That's a great question. We learn, and I've been teaching at Ohio State for 20 years now, and I tell my students, we just started class just this week, Tuesday, and in the first day of class, I tell my students that my goal in class is that by the end of class is for them to know everything that I know, right? Like, I want to share what I've learned with them. That's my goal. But then I also tell them that I fully intend and will learn from them as well, right? I will learn from them. We have to approach, as educators and teachers, talking about this thing called race and racism, not just as people who are sharing information, but what can we learn from the children, from young people? And I'm just not talking about college students, right? I'll share an example if I may. My youngest daughter, Alayla, when she was 4 years old, her preschool the teacher came up to me, approached me, and was like, Dr. Jeffries, we're having a King Day celebration, and we had a conversation with the kids, and they're not really that clear on who Martin Luther King was, and we would love for you to come in and speak to the kids. And I was like, hell no. Like, I don't want to talk to, 4-year-olds. I was like, one day ask too many questions, right? And I was like, that scares me. It scares me, right? Like, I don't want to do it. And I was like, no. And so the teachers, and the teacher, in an effort to comfort and convince me, she says, She says, oh, no, don't worry about it. We asked the kids who Martin Luther King was and what did he do? And they reached the conclusion that he slays dragons. And I was like, what? It was like, oh, and she says, because he's a king and that's what kings do, right? They slay dragons. So she said, oh, so you have nothing to worry. I was like, that doesn't comfort me, right? Like, what are you talking about? But anyway, so I agreed, right? So I agree. I go in and I talk to the kids, right? So 18 girls, she goes to all girls school, white and black, right? Kids, and to have this conversation about Martin Luther King. And I started by talking about the young King growing up in segregated Atlanta, Georgia, and the like. So before we get to I Have a Dream, right? Before we get to that part, we talk about King and why and what challenges did he face as a child. But then we talked about 1963 and the Birmingham Children's Campaign. And the children asked me, well, the one kid asked, well, I know Dr. King was killed, right? Like, why was he killed? And who killed him? Like, these are the questions that the kids were asking at 4 years old, right? And so they wanted to know. So I look at the teacher and she's like, green light. I'm like, all right, well, let's dive into it, right? Mm-hmm. And then we talked about the Children's Crusade, right? So young children who are, who take to the streets, who are their age, right? And older. And then another, one of the kids asked, were any of the children killed? Did any of them die with Dr. King? And I said, no. I said, no children died with Dr. King. It wasn't until later that night when I was at home and my 4-year-old, it was just her and I in the house. My other two were asleep. My wife was away and she's filibustering, trying not to go to sleep. Right. And so she jumps into bed. And so she knows me. So she wants to talk about today. And she's like, I'm like, you need to go to sleep. And she's like, no, she's like, Dad, she said, I learned a lot today. And I said, okay. I said, well, what did you learn? She said, I learned that no children were killed with Dr. King. And I said, that's right. But then I had to correct myself. I said, actually, that's not right. I said, I said that, but I was wrong because 4 little girls were killed in September, just a few months after that Birmingham Crusade. And then she asked me, she said, well, what were their names? Right. And I said, and I started to recite them. Right. Cynthia. And I said, wait, I said, actually, let me grab my phone. And I said, I'll pull them up. I can show you their pictures. I show her the pictures of the 4 little girls and she looks at one and she says, that looks just like Asha, which is her older sister, right? And then she goes on to tell me, so we're having this conversation about Dr. King and about what he meant and what he said. And then she says, so then she sort of like, okay, she's done. And she kind of begins to drift off to sleep and I'm tiptoeing around. And then just when I think she's asleep, and this is what I'm saying that we can learn from our children, even the youngest ones, she sort of turns around and she says, I think he was trying to tell us that America was broken. And I asked her to repeat herself. One, because I never had heard her sort of frame anything like that. And certainly I talk about, and I said, who are you talking about? And she says, Dr. King. I think he was trying to tell us that America was broken. She's absolutely right. Right. And I had never framed it to her like that. We had to talk, but she got it. Right. And so that's what I'm saying. We share with them and then we can learn from them. And so when I'm in class at the beginning and I'm teaching a civil rights class and I'm telling the kids, look, Dr. King was trying to tell us that this nation was broken, right? Quote unquote, my 4-year-old, right? And that's what I'm saying. They have a way, even the youngest ones, of listening and hearing what we're telling them, even when we are unable to articulate it in ways that they can grasp, or we think they can grasp, but they do. And then they give it back to us in these in ways that reflect a profound understanding, right? I think he was trying to tell us that America was broken. That's exactly what he was trying, and he lost his life trying to do so. So I think if we go into, the classroom, we go into our spaces in which we're engaging with, they will teach us something, not only about the nation, but they'll also teach us something about ourselves. We just have to be open and ready to accept the lesson.
Okay. Wow. Let's see. I think I have a question from the Q&A. She asked about the lessons reference that P.R.I.D.E created. So we can speak to that later. Those are the sessions that we offer in our training model. So my final question for us, and again, if you have a specific question for Dr. Jeffries, please put it in the Q&A. So in preparation for tonight's event, I shared a little bit of information with you about the anti-bias curriculum. And I think you had a chance to read through the 4 anti-bias goals. They have to do with helping young children develop a positive identity, helping them to be able to welcome and be open to people who are different from them. A third goal is to help children develop the ability to identify and give language to discrimination. And then finally, the 4th one is helping children to know that they have agency to act in opposition or resistance to discrimination. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the goals with respect to racial history, because when we share that information, it's during that same session where we talk about the history of race and racism, and then we sort of juxtapose the anti-bias goals and talk about how they actually counter those negative racist and oppressive attitudes towards people. And so it's like a good example of how educators can counter that. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about those goals with respect to racial history.
I think those are the 4 goals that we should be striving to achieve. And I love the way they're articulated, right? Including the aspect of empowering and making sure that our children see their own agency as actors. One of the most ridiculous criticisms that have been levied against those who are doing the wonderful work that you are doing and others, and centering conversations about racial identity, is that somehow talking about racism in American society is teaching our children of color that they somehow cannot succeed, right? That they somehow cannot achieve. And that's patently absurd, right? And the agency aspect and those 4 goals are actually setting up our children to succeed, right? But you can't do that unless they understand the obstacles that are put in front of them, right? I'm at Ohio State, right? This is Big Ten college football country, right? Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, y'all know a little something about football up there as well, right? College and professional. Look, you would not send, that's, not talking about this with young people, with students, right? Is like sending a quarterback out, right, in a football game and not telling him that there's a defense. And then he's throwing interceptions. And you're like, what are you doing? He's like, well, I didn't know they were going to catch it, right? I didn't know they were trying to stop me. That's what we're saying, right? You're preparing the children to go out and succeed, right? You wouldn't say, we're going to win the game and you never tell them about the defense. Right? Of course, you got to explain the defense. That doesn't mean that they can't get around the defense, that they can't score, but they sure as hell aren't going to score if they don't know what's out there. And so that's what it is. And as we connect with those 4 goals, I see as really trying to accomplish, because in the end, and how that connects to history and talking about these aspects of American history and the role of race and racism in it is, and I mentioned, right, when we talk about the past, it's about understanding the past to make sense of the present. So we're helping our children, and you're like, the youngest ones make sense? Absolutely. Make sense of the present. Because as they're moving through the world, they are observing the present. They're observing their lived environment, and they have to make sense of it. So understanding the past will help them make sense of the present. But that's not it. And those 4 goals speak to what that other bigger objective is as well. And that is to make sense of the present to solve the problems of the future, right? We are giving them the tools to help solve the problems of the future. Here, I love you, Jim. The 4-year-old is no longer 4, she said. Okay. I know you're 7. I know you're 7. And so that's key, because we're leaving them a mess, right? And it's so in the end, like, our children, no matter who they are not responsible for the past. No child is responsible for slavery. No child is responsible for Jim Crow that's alive today. No child is responsible for the mess that we find ourselves in, right? The fragility of American democracy right now. They're not responsible for that. But every single child who's alive today is responsible for the future, right? In some way, shape, or form. And so it's our duty as educators to provide them with what they need in order to solve the mess that we're leaving them. right? In this instance, we're talking about racial inequality and marginalizing people. We're also talking about climate change and all these other things. Like, they have to solve that. They're responsible for that. And it's our responsibility to prepare them, to give them the tools. You're not going to solve the issues of climate change and climate injustice if you are still embracing these ideas of white supremacy, because we're talking about a global crisis, right? And so it's all interrelated, right? And our children have to understand that as well.
Okay. So we are sort of running out of time. And so what I'd like to do is switch the program just really quickly and take one question from the audience and then do our poll. I hope that works out okay for Amy, our technical person. And the question is, what would you say to teachers who feel ill-equipped and scared to be discussing race with their students? And also a second question is, what resources would you recommend?
Well, I would say, one, that they're not alone, right? And it's not just teachers who may feel a reluctance and a hesitancy in general, even before the madness of all these critical race theory laws and divisive subject silliness, right? So even before that, working with the Southern Poverty Law Center's Learning for Justice Division, we did a survey of some 1,000 teachers and found that more than 80% of the teachers that we polled wanted to teach these subjects, wanted to teach hard history, wanted to dive in and have honest and frank conversations around race and racism. But only about 15% of them said they felt comfortable in their preparation. And so that's part of the challenge, right? Is that we know teachers want to do this. And this is before they could lose their job, right? Before you would have, we know, but then you have this hesitancy, right? Because they don't feel prepared, and they're not prepared because they're not coming through the P.R.I.D.E program. They're not coming, and learning this in their college and graduate school education. So we understand that. So what can we do? One, recognize that we're not alone. They're not alone. But then two, it is about being a lifelong learner, right? It doesn't mean you got to go back and get a PhD, right, to figure this stuff out. But you do have to be open to drawing in new resources, right? And at the Southern Poverty Law Center's Learning for Justice, we have a suite of resources that teachers can use and draw on to talk about this in the classroom. I mean, that's available. The Zen Education Project, again, suites of resources that teachers can use to bring in the classroom. And so they don't have to do, they don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? That material is out there and it's available and they can bring it in. But I would say this lastly, especially given the political climate that we are in, that look, we don't have a choice in the matter, right? We actually have truth on our side when talking about this history, right? Like, we don't have to make anything up, right? What we are saying is that we are going to teach truth and we are going to talk truth. And as educators, I mean, that is our charge. I mean, to do anything else is to commit educational malpractice. Right? I mean, so is it scary, right? Depending upon where we are, yes. Could some of us lose our job? Yes. But guess what? People lost their lives, right? So that we could be in a position to talk about this history honestly. Our young children were out in the streets facing this over-militarized police telling us they want to learn this stuff, right? And so I think it is our obligation to do it. Now, you do it in a way, depending upon where you are, that is smart, right? I mean, politically smart, right? You don't walk, depending upon where you are, you ain't walking in rural Ohio talking about, okay, today's lesson is on critical race theory. Like, why? That battle has been lost. But that doesn't mean you're not going to talk about the role of race and racism in society. So you do it in smart ways, right? But also understand that we are on the right side of history. And when history looks back at this moment and says, well, what did you teach, right? You want to be able to say that you taught the truth. And that means talking about and teaching this material and not avoiding. See, someone like, well, I just won't talk about it. That's miseducation too. You just can't leave out part of the equation and think the kid is going to get the right answer, right? No, right? You got to deal with the whole thing. And lastly, I would say those who are in positions that have more administrative support, they really have to model this, right? Because we're not all in the same position, right? And so those who are in school districts, who are in buildings, these are mostly urban districts that have this kind of support, then they really have to model this, whereas others can sort of, and perhaps point to it. I'm working with the state of Connecticut right now, is completely revising its social studies curriculum, state standards, right? And I'm like, we got to get this right, because teachers in Alabama need to point to this. Teachers in Florida need to point to this, right? And so those who have the space to do the work and do it right have to do it publicly, so that others can look to us and look to them for support.
Thank you for that, Hassan. I think now if Amy is able, could she pull up our poll so we could get some feedback from folks in the audience? So please respond to the poll. Numbers are coming in rather quickly. Waiting for a few more, maybe. Okay, let's see. All right, thank you all. I think we can save that, right, Amy? There's a way for us to save that. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the final part of our program, and that is our usual fun raffle. This time we will be raffling off 2 sets of children's picture books. I think you need to go down one more slide, maybe, Amy. The first book is, you can go back one, Fry-Bread. And the second is Aunt Harriet's Underground Railroad in the Sky. Fry-Bread's by Kevin Noble Mallard, and Aunt Harriet's Underground Railroad in the Skies by Faith Ringgold. The winner of that set of books is Emily Dollar, D-A-L-L-E-R. So congratulations, Emily. And then our second set of books is We Are Grateful by Tracy Sorrell, and the many thousand gone African Americans from Slavery to Freedom by Virginia Hamilton. And the winner of those 2 books is Tara Kirkton. So congratulations, Emily and Tara. So we have about 4 minutes left. I don't know if we have enough time for another question or not. So what I'll do is I'll put a plug in for our upcoming program, but I just want to congratulate the winners and thank everybody again for taking time to come out to be with us this evening. I want you to please remember that we have another Pride Speaker Series event coming up on November 10th. This one will focus on another Pride training module. This one looking at the history of race and racism in the profession. For that, we have some heavy hitters, the authors of Don't Look Away, Yoma Aruka, Stephanie Currington, Carrie Ann Eskai, and Tony Durden. So we have 3 minutes. Maybe we can do one more question. I do see a question here. This question from the audience asks, what are your thoughts about teaching the history of resistance to young children? The history of resistance. I think you spoke to that a little, but if you want to spend maybe a minute or so responding.
Absolutely. I was just typing in a response because I thought that's such a critical question. And in fact, it's absolutely necessary to teach Black resistance. One of the core resistance in general, one of the core characteristics of the Black experience is the persistence of resistance. But it's so important, in fact, that I actually lead with it. I suggest leading with resistance to oppression, resistance to white supremacy, because it's in the resistance that children see the humanity of the marginalized, of the oppressed. because and as they're seeing the situation, well, why didn't they do this? Right? Why didn't you run away? Why didn't you fight back? They're always fighting back. Right. And so you actually lead with the resistance and say, no, these people are fighting back. And then get into, well, what are the particulars of the situation and the circumstance? The resistance allows children to see the humanity of the oppressed. And so I say lead with resistance and then fill in the rest of the story, because that way the kids recognize the humanity of the people we're talking about.
Okay, awesome. I like that. Starting with it rather than making it second, something that you teach after the fact. Yeah. Thank you again, Hassan. I can tell you, I could have listened to you talk for hours on end, certainly. I'm guessing that other people felt the same way in the audience. I want to close by encouraging all the educators out there to not only learn about history, but teach it, as Hassan has suggested, to young children. Children appreciate history to a greater degree when they learn it early. I didn't know that. Learning history helps them develop a sense of identity. History can help children develop compassion and empathy. And learning about local history can help them build connections to their community. I hope you all found tonight's event useful and worth your time. And I want to thank you one more time for joining us. Please have a wonderful evening. And thanks again so much to all of our technical folks, to Cynthia for her beautiful story that started us off, and to Hassan for so many of those gems and words of wisdom. I hope you all have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone. Be safe.